My beloved child. Listen carefully, because the strangest part of this story was never the accusation itself, it was the silence that followed it. Your soulmate had expected their family to dislike the connection, question the timing, perhaps even wonder whether the two of you were truly right for each other. What they never expected was to hear someone quietly say that everything had started going wrong because of you. Not because of something you had actually done. Not because of an argument, a betrayal, or a mistake anyone could point toward. They simply looked at a collection of old family struggles, recent misunderstandings, and changes they could not explain, and somehow placed your name in the center of all of it. One relative used words that stayed in your soulmate's mind long after the conversation ended. Ever since this person entered your life, our family has changed. Then another voice went even further, suggesting that you had somehow brought a curse into their bloodline. Your soulmate did not answer immediately. And that silence mattered, because something inside them was beginning to notice what everyone else had overlooked. You had never asked them to abandon their family. You had never encouraged division. You had never demanded that they choose sides. In fact, some of the changes being blamed on you had started long before you entered the picture. So why did your name suddenly become the easiest explanation? That question became impossible to ignore. Don't skip, because the answer did not arrive through some dramatic confrontation. It appeared quietly, through one detail almost everyone had forgotten. There was an old pattern inside this family, something your soulmate had grown so accustomed to that they barely recognized it anymore. Whenever one person changed, someone else became uncomfortable. Whenever someone finally spoke honestly, the atmosphere shifted. Whenever a family member stopped repeating an old habit, people searched for an outside reason instead of asking why the habit existed in the first place. And then you came along. You did something surprisingly simple. You made your soulmate think differently about themselves. Around you, they began expressing feelings they usually buried. They started saying no when they meant no. They stopped agreeing just to keep everyone comfortable. They began imagining a future based on what felt peaceful and meaningful rather than what had always been expected of them. None of those things were dangerous. None of them were mysterious. But to people who had known only the older version of your soulmate, the transformation felt unfamiliar. And unfamiliar things are sometimes given frightening names when people do not yet understand them. That was when your soulmate remembered a conversation from months earlier. Someone in the family had complained, "You're not acting like yourself anymore." At the time, your soulmate felt guilty hearing it. Now they were beginning to wonder, what if they were finally acting more like themselves than ever? Then something unexpected happened. A family member who had remained almost completely silent during the accusations asked one calm question: "What exactly has this person done?" The room changed. Not dramatically. No one shouted. No one stormed away. There was simply a pause, the kind of pause that reveals more than an argument ever could. One person mentioned that your soulmate had become more distant. Another said they were making decisions differently. Someone else brought up an old disagreement that had nothing to do with you at all. But when they tried to name one specific thing you had actually done to harm the family, no clear answer appeared. Your soulmate noticed it immediately. The accusation was enormous, yet the evidence underneath it was strangely empty. Something important is waiting for you here, because this became the first crack in the story they had been told. Your soulmate began looking backward, carefully separating what happened because of your relationship from what had already been happening inside the family. And the further they looked, the clearer the picture became. Years before you were known to them, the same tensions existed. The same misunderstandings returned in different forms. People avoided difficult conversations, then wondered why resentment accumulated. Certain expectations were never spoken openly, yet everyone was somehow expected to follow them. When someone stepped outside those expectations, another person felt rejected. Your soulmate suddenly remembered being younger and watching almost identical situations unfold around different people. There had always been someone blamed whenever the family felt unstable. Sometimes it was a friend. Sometimes a partner. Sometimes a relative who moved away. The names changed, but the pattern remained. That realization softened something inside your soulmate. They stopped wondering, what if they're right about you, and started asking a much more revealing question: why does our family need someone to blame whenever something changes? And here is where the story becomes personal. Your soulmate thought about the moments no one else had witnessed. The quiet conversations between you. The times you encouraged them to speak respectfully rather than react emotionally. The moments you reminded them that loving someone did not require abandoning everyone else. They remembered how often you had chosen patience when misunderstanding would have been easier. They remembered the small kindnesses that would never become family gossip because kindness rarely travels as quickly as suspicion. And slowly, the accusation began losing its power. Not because your soulmate suddenly believed you were perfect. Real love does not require pretending anyone is perfect. It lost its power because the story being told about you did not match the person they actually knew. Still, one question remained. Why had the accusation become so intense now? Why this moment? Why suddenly speak about bloodlines, family patterns, and things that sounded much larger than an ordinary disagreement? Your soulmate would soon discover there was another conversation happening behind the scenes, and that conversation changed the meaning of everything. It started with an older relative finding something that had been kept for years. Nothing supernatural. Nothing frightening. Just a collection of old letters and family notes stored away with ordinary belongings. Inside them were references to conflicts from long ago, arguments between parents and children, disagreements over relationships, people leaving home because they felt controlled, others feeling abandoned because they did not understand why. Your soulmate read parts of those stories and felt an unexpected chill of recognition, not from fear, but from familiarity. The same emotional language being used against you had been used decades earlier against someone else. They changed you. Our family was never like this until they came. You've forgotten where you belong. Different generation. Different relationship. Almost identical words. Stay till the end, because this was where your soulmate stopped seeing you as the cause of a family pattern and started realizing you may have simply arrived at the moment when that pattern could no longer remain invisible. One letter stood out. It had been written by a family member many years earlier after choosing a relationship the family initially rejected. The writer admitted that everyone had blamed the outsider because blaming them was easier than admitting the family struggled whenever someone wanted independence. Years later, the same people eventually accepted the relationship. The feared disaster never arrived. Life simply continued, and the family slowly adjusted. Your soulmate read that passage twice. Then once more. Suddenly the dramatic language surrounding you felt less like a prophecy and more like an echo. But there was still one person your soulmate needed to speak with. Someone who had witnessed both the old story and the current one. Someone who had remained silent while your name was being questioned. When your soulmate finally approached them, they expected another warning. Instead, the person looked at them for a long moment and said something so simple that it rearranged the entire situation. I don't think this is really about them. Your soulmate froze. The relative continued carefully. They explained that the family had been under emotional strain for years, long before you appeared. Your arrival had simply coincided with your soulmate becoming stronger about their own choices. People were confusing correlation with cause. They saw change happening near your presence and assumed you created every uncomfortable part of it. But the deeper truth was different. Your soulmate was growing. And growth was exposing conversations the family had postponed for too long. That was the moment everything became quieter inside them. Not solved. Not magically repaired. Just clearer. And clarity can change the direction of an entire relationship. Your soulmate realized they did not need to attack their family to defend you. They did not need to create another conflict in the name of ending conflict. They simply needed to stop allowing an unfair story to stand uncontested. So they decided that when the subject came up again, they would speak differently. Calmly. Specifically. They would remind everyone that you were a person, not a symbol for everything the family feared losing. They would acknowledge that change can feel uncomfortable while still refusing to let discomfort become an accusation. But there is one more detail they had not discovered yet. One of the people who had repeated the strongest claim about you had privately admitted something completely different to that older relative. Something that revealed the real emotion hiding underneath all those dramatic words. It was not fear of a curse. It was fear of losing your soulmate's closeness. And once that confession reached your soulmate, they finally understood what this entire story had been trying to hide. The confession did not sound dramatic when it was finally spoken. That was what made it so powerful. The person who had repeated the harshest words about you had apparently admitted, in private, "I'm afraid they won't need us the same way anymore." Your soulmate sat with that sentence for a long time, because suddenly so many pieces began moving into place. The family had called your presence dangerous when what they were really struggling with was change. They had spoken about old patterns, loyalty, and everything supposedly shifting since you appeared. Yet beneath those words lived something painfully ordinary. They were afraid your soulmate was building a life that could no longer be shaped entirely by their expectations. And strangely, realizing this did not make your soulmate angry. It made them softer. They could finally see the difference between someone trying to harm a relationship and someone reacting badly because they were scared of becoming less important. That difference mattered. It meant the situation did not need another battle. It needed honesty. But there was one thing your soulmate still could not understand. Why had nobody simply said, "We miss you"? Why had something so human been disguised beneath an accusation so large? A few days later, another conversation began almost accidentally. Your soulmate had not planned some grand confrontation. They had simply returned home, sat with family, and listened. For a while nobody mentioned you. Ordinary topics filled the room. Food. Work. Something someone needed to repair. A story from years ago. And then your name appeared again, quietly, through a comment that sounded innocent enough: "You've been different lately." This time your soulmate did not become defensive. They did not retreat into silence either. They asked, "Different in what way?" That question created another pause. One person said they were harder to influence now. Someone corrected themselves quickly and changed the word to convince. Your soulmate noticed. So did the older relative who had spoken honestly earlier. Something important is waiting for you in that small correction, because your soulmate suddenly understood that some people had mistaken obedience for closeness. Whenever your soulmate agreed, everything felt peaceful. Whenever they made an independent choice, people interpreted it as distance. And because your relationship had given them enough emotional safety to think more clearly, your presence became associated with that independence. Then your soulmate said something no one expected. "Maybe I have changed. But that doesn't mean someone changed me." The room grew still. They continued, carefully choosing each word. They explained that meeting you had not erased their family, their history, or their values. It had simply helped them notice parts of themselves they had ignored. They were learning how to make choices without immediately asking whether everybody else approved. They were learning that disagreement did not automatically mean disrespect. And most importantly, they were learning that love could exist without ownership. No one answered immediately. Your soulmate could feel the tension, yet beneath it was something new: listening. For perhaps the first time, the conversation was no longer about whether you were good or bad. It was becoming about the family's relationship with change itself. Don't skip, because the next thing that happened was subtle enough to be missed, yet it changed your soulmate more deeply than any dramatic apology could have. One of the relatives who had been most suspicious of you lowered their voice and asked, "Are you happy?" Just that. No accusation. No warning. No argument. Your soulmate answered yes, but not instantly. They wanted the answer to be true, not automatic. They thought about your imperfections, their own, the misunderstandings you had faced, the uncertainty still surrounding the future. And even with all of that, the answer remained yes. Not because everything was effortless. Not because they believed some invisible force had guaranteed an outcome. They were happy because around you they felt able to be more truthful. They felt challenged to communicate instead of disappear. They felt seen without constantly having to perform a version of themselves everyone else found comfortable. When they explained that, something changed in the face across from them. The suspicion did not vanish, but it softened. That evening, your soulmate remembered a moment with you that had seemed small when it happened. You had once said something during an ordinary conversation after they worried about disappointing people they loved. You had told them they did not have to choose between caring for their family and being honest about their own life. At the time they nodded and moved on. Now those words returned with surprising weight. Because this was exactly the choice they had believed they were facing, you or them. Independence or belonging. Love or loyalty. But perhaps that choice had never been real. Perhaps the healthiest future would require something more difficult and more mature, loving people without surrendering every decision to them. The next morning brought another unexpected detail. Your soulmate received a message from someone in the family who had barely spoken during everything. The message was short: "Can we talk about what happened?" Your soulmate hesitated. They expected another attempt to persuade them. Instead, the person admitted that the language about you had gone too far. They had repeated things they did not fully believe because everyone else seemed convinced. They had watched your soulmate become more independent and privately wondered whether that was actually a bad thing. Then came the sentence your soulmate had needed to hear: "Maybe we blamed you because it was easier than admitting we were uncomfortable with losing control." That word stayed with them. Control. Not because every family member was controlling. Not because the entire family had acted with bad intentions. Human relationships are rarely that simple. But there had been moments when concern slipped into pressure, and tradition became expectation, and expectation became something nobody felt allowed to question. Your soulmate could finally see it without turning anyone into a villain. That was the quiet truth emerging from beneath the title everyone had given this story. There was no mysterious stain attached to you. There was no evidence that your presence had damaged some family destiny. There were simply old emotional habits meeting a new relationship and resisting what they could not immediately understand. Stay till the end, because your soulmate's next realization was even more personal. They began asking themselves why they had stayed silent when people first spoke about you that way. The answer was uncomfortable. A small part of them had still been seeking permission. They wanted their family to tell them that loving you was acceptable. They wanted approval to remove the burden of making the choice themselves. And when approval did not come, they became confused. But now they understood that adult love sometimes asks a person to stop outsourcing their deepest decisions. Advice can matter. Family can matter. Concern can matter. But eventually, a person must look at the reality of a relationship and decide what they believe with their own eyes. Your soulmate thought about how you behaved when nobody was watching. How you spoke when there was nothing to gain. How you responded when they were uncertain. They remembered moments you could have pushed harder but chose restraint. Moments you could have encouraged resentment but instead asked them to understand the other side. They remembered that you had never celebrated their distance from family. If anything, you had hoped those relationships could become healthier. That memory settled something inside them. Then came the conversation you may never have expected. Your soulmate went back to the relative who had first used the strongest language against you. Not to demand an apology. Not to force agreement. They simply said, "I know you're worried about losing me." The person looked stunned. Their first instinct was denial, but your soulmate did not argue. They continued gently, "You're not losing me. But I am changing." Those aren't the same thing. Something inside that relative seemed to give way. The anger they had been carrying suddenly looked more like sadness. They admitted that the family used to feel different. Your soulmate had once called more often, asked for advice more frequently, depended on them for decisions. Now they were building something new, and it frightened them. "I thought this relationship was taking you away," they said. Your soulmate answered with a line that surprised even them, "Maybe I'm not being taken away. Maybe I'm just becoming responsible for my own life. There it was. The truth that had been hiding underneath everything. And once it was spoken, the entire idea that you had somehow cursed anything began to look almost painfully misplaced. You had become the name attached to a transition that was already waiting to happen. Your soulmate was growing into a version of themselves who could love their family deeply without remaining emotionally dependent on their approval. That transition might have happened with or without you. Your presence simply made it visible. But the story was not finished. Because later that night, your soulmate learned that someone had actually known this from the beginning. Someone who had defended neither side publicly. Someone who had watched the accusations unfold while holding back one piece of information that could have changed the conversation much earlier. And when that person finally explained why they had remained silent, your soulmate realized there was still one deeper family truth nobody had been willing to say aloud.